My great pleasure to introduce Pavel Khodorkovsky, the president of the Institute of Modern Russia, an organization he founded to continue the work his father, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, began through the Open Russian Foundation. Of course, we all know that almost a decade ago, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, then the owner of the Yucas oil company and Russia's richest man, stood up to Vladimir Putin, Russia's then and again president. Mikhail Khodorkovsky angered the Kremlin by financing opposition parties, opposition movements, and denouncing the scale of corruption in Russia, with an outcome well known to us all. What is less well known is that his Open Russia Foundation, founded in 2001 by the Yucas Oil Company, an international, independent, charitable organization operating as a private endowment, supported both academic institutions and not-for-profit organizations. The motivation for the establishment of the Open Russian Foundation was the wish to foster enhanced openness, understanding, and integration between the people or the peoples of Russia and the rest of the world. By some estimates, Khodorkovsky was supporting half of all non-government organizations in Russia, if not more. I vividly remember a news program that aired shortly after Khodorkovsky's arrest on the Russian state-supported First Channel. It showed Putin visiting a provincial secondary school that was fully equipped with personal computers for each student. The TV program was designed to demonstrate the success of Putin's policies and show how much he cared about ordinary people, including the secondary school students. The only one thing was the school's computers had been provided by Khodorkovsky's Open Russia Foundation, which of course was not mentioned during the show. One way to think about the work of Pavel Khodorkovsky, our guest for today, is to see it as an enormously important act of building continuity. The Institute of Modern Russia that Pavel leads, with a group of young and energetic lawyers, journalists, and political scientists, some of whom were forced to leave Russia, they promote the values Pavel's father stood for, developing civil society in Russia by reinforcing the rule of law and strengthening the relationship between Russia and other countries. We are honored to have Pavel Khodorkovsky here today to speak on the topic, Trade in Your Human Rights, a Path to Sovereign Democracy.
Thank you. Thank you. Olga, thank you very much for the very, very nice and flattering introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time in Michigan and my first time at your university. I've been told that I brought in some nice weather, so I will take full credit for this nice change of brief change of seasons. It's going to be very cold again tomorrow. And let me try to get this up on the screen. Yes, it works. So, what I wanted to talk to you about is transition. Transition that has happened to my country over the course of the last, give or take, 12 years, almost 12 years. And I will focus on both the choices that were made by the government, the choices that were made by the society, where we were and where we stand today. And hopefully after that we can have a discussion of what the future holds and whether this trend of the so-called sovereign democracy can be reversed to a more well-perceived notion of true democracy. So the first thing that I wanted to remember is the Yeltsin Last day on national TV. Was the New Year's Eve of 1999, and although I was still fairly young, I remember vividly how that announcement that he gave of his resignation signified to a degree an end of an era. And obviously I did not realize that at the time, but looking back, that was one of the important stepping stones to the transition that has happened next. Yeltsin made a number of doubtful choices, but I think that as a whole, the country at that point was on the right path, was on a democratic model, and although it has experienced a lot of pains of transitioning from a Soviet planned economy to an open market economy, with all the underlying problems that the society has attributed to its leaders. In general, I think it was on a right trajectory. The choices that Putin made were on the other end of the spectrum. And I should preempt those choices by saying that his entire rule from the beginning was focused on the premise of loyalty. Yeltsin chose this man as the man who could provide a degree of personal protection to his family, because he could recognize the value he has placed on loyalty. And Putin's choices over the next 12 years have basically been made on the same premise. So the model that he has chosen was more or less authoritarian model. And I don't think that at the time Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was making those choices, he could clearly see where he was driving the country. I don't believe that he has had a mastermind plan for the next 12 years, but some of the personal beliefs that he has had and the circle of friends that he has brought in with him into the presidential administration have basically outlined the path of the transition to this authoritarian model. So what are the kinds of things that the authoritarian ruler tries to do? Tries to consolidate power. So one of the first stepping stones on this path was integrating the entire power structure. And this started happening with Mr. Putin bringing in his close friends from the St. Petersburg administration, his close former colleagues from FSB and the KGB organizations, and making sure that he has had vertically integrated control of the bureaucratic structure in Russia. That had to do with the government. Then another big problem is the society. How do you explain to the people that have embraced democratic values that you are going to consolidate power in and around one man's position in the government, and at the same time provide growth to the country? You sign a so-called social contract that has been referenced to time and again over the course of the last 6 years, and obviously I don't think there was ever this notion at the time, but the premise of this deal was simple. Putin provides stability in exchange for non-participation, non-involvement of the society in political affairs and the political life of the country. So the social contract has resonated really well with the Russian society at a time. There is always this notion of a paternalistic leader that is able to carry the country, provide stability, provide security. So this promise of restoring Russia's image, providing growth, has resonated well with the society at the time. But there was another big problem. By the end of 1999, there was a group of industrialists, capitalists, the so-called oligarchs, that essentially had a very, very strong controlling stake in most of the former state-run enterprises that were privatized, and hence controlled a significant amount of resources and have started to experiment with the idea of lobbying. One of the things that Putin needed to achieve as part of his transition to the authoritarian model was to rein in this group. And at the time, in the year 2000, Putin as a leader was still fairly weak. So he needed to establish a precedent. And unfortunately, my father and his company, the Yucas Oil Company, ended up being that precedent. It started in February of 2003 at the meeting, by now famous meeting, of the Russian Union of Entrepreneurs and Industrialists, the so-called RSPP, where my father has engaged in open discussion about corruption and the state of the impact that the corruption has on the GDP of the country and the decision-making process in the state-run companies. Unfortunately for my father, he has selected a transaction to illustrate the point that President and his close friends have allegedly been involved in. So that clearly rubbed Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin the wrong way. And people say that this has catalyzed the attack on Yucas. Obviously, the reality is a little bit more nuanced, and by now we've known that the attack on Yucas and this whole idea of creating this show trial to demonstrate how the power will be taken back from the oligarchs has obviously been discussed a number of months before this meeting. The meeting was purely a catalyst to the actual launch of legal proceedings against Yucas Oil Company and my father personally. But we should take into account the fact that Putin had to operate in the framework of an established system where the judiciary had to be independent. So he had to establish a precedent of how these show trials are going to culminate in the demise of the oligarchs, and will ensure that his political control is not challenged while he remains in power. So the idea was fairly simple. You take the strongest company and the most visible leader that is involved in financing the opposition, that has engaged through his nonprofit organization in investing in education and what could at the time be perceived as ideology, because the Open Russia Foundation was promoting democratic values, and you crush that company. Crush that company, you imprison its CEO and largest shareholder, and that sends a message. And unfortunately, this model has worked really well. That enabled Putin and his government to completely neuter the financing of the political opposition parties for the next 10 years, 11 years by now. the things that needed to be done in the court were a little more difficult. And by now we talk about all of them as instances of telephone justice. If we go into a little bit more detail of how the actual process was carried out, we see that there were numerous instances of retroactive application of law. So for example, my father's company has been optimizing the taxation burden by utilizing legal tax havens established within the Russian Federation. The case against Yucas was launched at the end of 2003. My father was arrested on the 25th of October. The case went to court next year. The practice of using internal tax havens was outlawed in 2004. However, the period in question, up until 2003, and the practices that were used by Yucas to optimize its tax burden were at the time completely legal. However, we see this retroactive application of law essentially used to imprison the man and place an unbearable tax burden and fees on the company that my father has control. But the reason why I bring all of this into focus in the beginning of this presentation, because I think that it was a very important beginning point after which the entire judicial system has disintegrated. And my father's case and Yucas trials were not important in and of themselves and what has happened to the company, although the company employed more than 100,000 people. It's important because they established a number of precedents and gave rise to the so-called raider schemes that were all inspired by the Yucas case. The trouble that the business faced after the Yucas trial was that bureaucrats have embraced the model of retroactive application of law and using court system as a resource in either political struggles, power struggles, or business conflicts to either completely nationalize the business, as was the case in other instances following the Yucas trial, or take conflicting business interests and solve them by using court as an essential tool. However, there were a number of other things that have happened after the Yucas case that have further exacerbated the legal rule of law troubles that my country has faced. Medvedev came to power on the basis of modernization of the entire country. He promised a number of things to try and rectify the Russian image, and one of the things that he has promised was fighting the legal nihilism. And we should give the man a little bit of a credit. He has tried to introduce legislation that would address some of the most painful aspects of using courts as a tool in the business conflict. Well, as an example, it's the pretrial detention, the 3 months pretrial detention that was often used as a pretext to detain, that was used as a tool, to detain the CEO, chairman, or top manager of a company that would essentially disable their opportunity to fight an attack, because this pretrial detention period could be extended virtually without any limits. So the law that Medvedev has introduced annulled this practice. However, this law in a number of high-profile cases, including the second trial of my father, was never actually implemented. The rule of law problems permeated the country as a whole further and have descended into the selective justice being applied in non-business related cases. As we know, there were a number of police usurpation of power, where they would essentially detain people for very, very minor offenses and use the system that has formed in the Russian judiciary of bringing the case to the court and almost being guaranteed a guilty verdict. The cases of selective justice in non-business instances were extremely visible in the latest round of protests that has happened over the course of the last year, where people were being detained on the streets and fines and detention periods ruled in the courtroom, where the activists were selectively targeted to try and temper the protest movements. So all of this was based on the idea of ignoring laws and manipulating the public opinion to try and portray the authoritarian model that was being built as the most effective and the most appropriate to the Russian society. The further troubles that have permeated the system included the crimes within the penitentiary system. You probably have heard of the famous case of Sergei Magnitsky, who was a lawyer who has unfortunately died in prison because he was being beaten by the investigators and denied medical treatment. A similar thing happened with Vasily Alexanyan, who was a legal counsel to Yucas oil company. He was denied medical treatment in jail and was only able to finally access a medical facility after his ridiculous bail of $2 million was posted and he got access to medical treatment, but unfortunately that was too late and he has died soon after his release. But those, once again, those two examples are only the most visible cases. If you go online and you read the few remaining open sources of information, like Novaya Gazeta and Nezavisимая Gazeta, there are numerous similar cases documented where people are being thrown in jail for pretrial detention, beaten, and police essentially extorting ridiculous amounts of money to secure their release. Another thing that has happened, which was a clear violation of human rights, was passing a number of laws that have limited the freedom of assembly. And one of the key things was the permitting system that became required to hold mass rallies. Right now in Russia, it's only possible to hold a single protest rally, so-called одиночный пикет, which is essentially destroying all legal opportunity for people to voice their concern, to go on the streets and peacefully protest. The procedure for securing the legal permit that would allow mass gatherings is extremely complicated and depends entirely on the will of the local municipality. And the opposition movement has always been at the mercy of, for example, the government of local government of Moscow and its mayor to secure those permits. And if it so happens that the permit is not granted, all public protests are illegal. Another piece of legislation that was recently passed following the protest movement in the beginning of this year levied unreasonable fines on people who have been detained during the protests and essentially is acting as a deterrent for people with modest income to participate, because 300, I believe the figure right now is 300 times the standard level of income. That's something that's not possible to pay up if you're found guilty of participating in an illegal gathering. So all of these various steps that have been taken by the Russian government fell under this umbrella of building a new system. And it's not quite authoritarianism. So Putin had to come up with a way of how to describe this system so that he could present a reasonable explanation of what has been happening domestically, and at the same time keep some semblance of face in the West. So the notion that he has come up with, and the term that he has coined, sovereign democracy, which is, in my mind, a very contradictory term, because democracy means the rule of the people, and frankly, the sovereign part is a very, very ambiguous, makes for a very, very ambiguous term. But I think the best example of actual application of this new model was the switch announcement in September 2011. And this announcement of Putin and Medvedev publicly speaking of their decision to switch back places in 2007, long before the upcoming, at that time, presidential elections, has really catalyzed the unrest in the society. Because it's one thing when you tell people that the various limitations on personal freedoms and some instances of human rights violations are really benefiting the society and are providing the stability and the sense of growth. And at the same time, you're providing a semblance of election process, even though the results are predetermined. You are giving people the opportunity to participate in something that, if they are willing to deceive themselves, they can feel like they're being part of a democratic system. However, openly calling it a sovereign democracy and following up with an announcement that the switch is taking place and Mr. Putin in effect nominating himself as a successor to Medvedev, and Medvedev following up and saying that, of course, I will extend the same courtesy and will accept your nomination as the head of government, catalyzed this shift in public opinion. So in my mind, the protests are an indicator of breaking the social contract that has been forged in the beginning of Putin's rule. Stability and prosperity, I think, bring an appetite for self-respect. It is one of the steps on the path to growth, personal growth and societal growth, that once your basic needs are addressed, once you have a sense of security in terms of the financial opportunities, you start to aspire to something more. And the system standing in a way essentially becomes a glass ceiling on this path of personal growth. And I believe that up until this announcement, Russian society has been deceiving itself and believing that the country will progress and there are going to be plenty of opportunities. You know, look at all these nice things happening. I was not able to get a mortgage for my house, to purchase a house, now I'm able to do this, or all these employment opportunities. I think that ultimately it became a little bit more clear, I wouldn't say obvious, but a little bit more clear of how the system is ultimately capping out opportunity at the personal level. And it is much more evident for the middle class and people who are working in the in the managerial positions and are looking to open up their own business as the next step of developing their careers. And they realize that without the connections and without financial capacity to pay up the bribes, they are not able to progress personally. And that contributes to this feeling of a glass ceiling above you, of the system standing in your way. I have a friend of mine who has opened up a restaurant in Klin, which is a city very close to Moscow, because she was unable to do so in the capital, even though she's from Moscow, she's lived there all of her life. But she has this entrepreneurial spirit, and she decided that she'll open up her small business, but very quickly realized that it is impossible to do so in the capital. The idea that you have to perceive corruption as Russia's special way does not really resonate with people who have traveled to countries abroad, who have maybe studied abroad, and realize that there is a potential for a functioning society and a functional government system that does not embrace corruption. So Vita, my friend, has ended up in Klin, and she has taken the uncommon stance of waiting for permits for 6 months instead of solving the problem and bringing up a small payment to secure that liquor license, to make sure that you pass the fire inspection. But this clearly contributed to her sense of the government as a whole, of the bureaucracy standing in the way of her development, for personal growth. A lot of the response that I often encounter after talking about middle class is that, unfortunately, this middle class is a very, very thin strata of the Russian society, and it means nothing for the broad perception of government across the entire population of Russia. But I think that the problem that system as a whole has started to experience is the shortcomings of manual control. Because unfortunately, the lack of institutions in the society and pervasive corruption means that Putin and his administration cannot rely on any functioning procedures. And every time there is, for example, a natural disaster, or there is a quick response required by the local government, they cannot count on those bureaucracies functioning properly. So every time there is an instance of manual control, the society as a whole realizes that the system is not working. And I think that has engaged a much wider spectrum of the society and demonstrated to the other classes of the Russian society that the system is not optimal. So this permeating dissatisfaction and realization that, yes, the government is actually responsible for some of the events that happen across the country, that there is a systemic problem, contributed to the formation of this demand for reforms. And that ultimately led to people spilling out on the streets of Moscow and other large cities in Russia, demanding the promised reforms that have never been carried out, demanding that the empty promises for modernization and battling corruption and return to the rule of law are actually coming, demanding that they actually come to life. So I think that there is a very, very pragmatic hope that I'll try to outline right now of how this can be reversed, of how the strand of the authoritarian model and trading in human rights for stability can be reversed. And the cornerstone of, I firmly believe that the cornerstone of these systemic problems that we have is the lack of independent judiciary. Because ultimately there is no personal protection in courts, there is no protection for your business, and that leads to a number of societal problems, and that leads to a number of investment problems that the country is now experiencing. So there are pragmatic reasons to reestablish this rule of law. As you may know, there are so-called two different camps in the presidential administration right now. The liberal camp, not in the sense of, not in the common sense of the word, but the more liberal than the rest, including such figures as Dvorkovich, Shuvalov, and Medvedev himself, who have a much more diversified area of interests and participate in more sophisticated business models, as opposed to the so-called Siloviki, the strongman camp. Ivanov, Sechin, and a number of close friends of Putin who are in charge of companies actually exporting Russia's oil and gas. I believe that the liberal camp is actually pragmatically interested in reestablishing the rule of law, because the reliance on natural resource exports and utilizing them as the foreign policy tool hurts their interests, and also they have a new goal of cementing their newly acquired property rights and legally binding those rights. Because right now, the only thing that protects their interests is the top level of hierarchy in the Russian government. And unfortunately, all of this is based on loyalty, so if the Putin administration all of a sudden goes, there is no one to protect this newly acquired property. So I do believe that there is a possibility for the return of the rule of law. That's not going to be catalyzed from new policy of foreign countries. It's not going to be catalyzed by the public protests, but I think there is a hope for the return of rule of law because of these pragmatic reasons that the liberal camp might have a very, very strong interest in achieving. My personal hope of this process would obviously be the release of my father. And I believe that since the Yucas case and Mikhail Khodorkovsky's imprisonment back in 2003 has set off this chain of events that have disintegrated the judicial system and crippled the rule of law in Russia, that setting him and Platon Lebedev and Alexei Pichugin free, the other two names that I mentioned are his close friend and business partner that was arrested as part of the Yucas case, and the head of Economic Security Division in Yucas, that their release might catalyze and reverse this trend and ultimately return return the country to a functioning system that embraces the rule of law as one of its working, underlying procedures. So, as I'm more used to giving business presentations recently, so as every good business presentation in the end should have this slide that's called the ask. I'm going to use this opportunity to ask for something of you. As you are leaving the room, there are sheets which have exactly the same text, and that's the petition for the release of my father, affectionately called MBK, Mikhail Borisovich Khodorkovsky. This had started actually when he was still CEO of Yucas. Instead of writing out his full name and the signature of his email, he would always sign with his initials. So this was, even 9 years after his arrest, it's still being used by my family as abbreviate his rather lengthy name. So the petition for the release of MBK calls on the Russian President Vladimir Putin to right what he has done wrong back in 2003 and to hopefully push this country that I still do dearly love to return to the normal state of democracy by reestablishing the rule of law. There is more information available than what I have shared with you today, both on the website of our institute, IamRussia.org, and on the two websites that have tracked the progress of my father's case. Khodorkovskycenter.com is in English and Khodorkovsky.ru in Russian. So I've made it in 35 minutes, and I hope that we can have a discussion. So please feel free to ask questions, and here I'm yours to answer.
Thank you very much. This is a wonderful presentation. I'm sure many of you have questions. Let me tell you how we will structure that. We have a microphone right in the middle of, right between, in the aisle. So if you have a question, please do not be shy. Please come to the microphone and ask a question. And I also want to bring your attention to the exhibition at the end. It's a post-Soviet graffiti. It's 24 fieldwork photographic representations of modern Russia cut from various aspects. And we, the Center for Russian, East European and Eurasian Studies, co-host this exhibition. And actually it's Alex Zimberg, director of the show. You are here, right? Okay. And thank you very much for offering this. So now we turn to the questions. You will take questions by yourself, yes, right? So please feel free to come to the microphone and ask questions. And I hope we will have very vivid discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
We don't know, it is personal question because
Please, introduce yourself.
My name is Inna Gorlova and I'm adjunct faculty at Eastern Michigan University. We don't know very much about your family. I read about your mother after what happened to your father. Could you tell a little bit? It would be nice to hear.
Sure. I'll try to condense it. So, first of all, my father has had other kids. I'm a representative of a much bigger group. There are 4 of us. I have 2 twin brothers and a sister. They are a little bit younger than me. My sister is now 21. My brother's just turned 13. My father was married twice, so I'm the kid from the first marriage. And my mother's name is Yelena Khodorkovskaya, and my father's current wife's name is Inna. My brothers are Ilya and Gleb, and my sister's name is Anastasia. All of them remain, my father's family, his current wife and the other 3 kids remain in Russia. Myself and my mom are here in the United States, and I have, since I've been here for quite some time, I have started my own family, and I have a wife and a young child. She's 2.5, well, actually, I keep saying that she's 2.5 years old. She's almost 3. She's turning 3 in December. Her name is Diana. Unfortunately, her grandfather has never seen her. We, as a family, have not been back to Russia since my father's arrest. In the beginning, just following his advice, and right now, realizing that we would not want to become lever against my father, because ultimately his strength and courage are the ones that are sustaining him in jail for the last 9 years. And I think that Mr. Putin still has a wish and hope that my father would admit guilt, so we would not want to become an instrument in that, in reaching that particular goal. However, my other members of the family are extremely brave, and they remain in Russia, and they do speak out on my dad's behalf. My grandmother, Marina, and she, I can't say anything more, she's a very, very brave person. I have the opportunity to do this because I live in the United States, and I frankly don't have any risk, or very little risk, except only when I travel outside the States. So that's the story in a nutshell.
You mentioned that other people who were imprisoned in Russia were beaten. What kind of access does your family have to your father? And do you have reason to believe that he has been beaten or otherwise tortured in prison?
So right now my father is in penal colony, so-called penal colony number 7 in the little town of Segezha, that's in Karelia, about 700 kilometers north of St. Petersburg. He has been to a number of prisons. He has been at the penal colony in Krasnokamensk, and prison in Chita, a couple of prisons during the transfers by train, and has spent most of his time during pretrial detention and then during the court hearings in Matrosskaya Tishina, the prison, the famous prison in Moscow. My family does have an opportunity to visit him, but right now it's very limited. It's limited to in-person 3-hour, so-called short rendezvous, in-person 3-hour meetings every 2 months. My grandparents and my father's wife alternate those meetings, and then there are the so-called long rendezvous, almost 3 days. It's supposed to be in this little apartment that's part of the prison or penal colony compound, but in reality it's just one room under CCTV, so everything is recorded, everything is listened to, but it's not across the table, and it's not through the glass over the telephone, but it's one-on-one. So my brothers and my sister did get to see him a couple of times already after his transfer to the penal colony in Karelia. My father was attacked once when he was in Krasnokamensk. That's a Chita region that's almost on the border with China, about 6,000 kilometers away from Moscow. An inmate stabbed him with a knife. According to his testimony later, he was trying to aim for his eye, and in the last moment his hand slipped and he has cut my father's face. But he was very lucky, and there was a good surgeon available in the Krasnokamensk colony, so he got stitches and he's fine. The inmate stated that he wanted to get transferred out of that colony because he has quarreled with other inmates, and so he figured out that there was the easiest way to achieve his goal by attacking the most closely watched inmate. But I do believe that there is a possibility of the prison colony administration actually instigating this attack as another way to intimidate my father and scare his family.
Well, I have this question. First of all, I'm really sorry that your father is in prison. But my question concerns the letters, the open letters that your father authored, and they were published, well, not that recently, but there were, I think, two or three of them, and where he wrote about the social situation in Russia and about the guilt that he personally feels. Well, he probably does not use the word guilt, I do not remember well exactly, but the meaning is that, we are guilty because the Russian people, by we, he probably means the richer part of society, or the oligarchs, or the industrialists, or the entrepreneurs, or the business people. We are guilty because of what was done to the Russian people in the 1990s during the privatization, etc. So it was interpreted as this kind of a leftist term in his thinking about society. So can you comment on this in any way? Can you add anything to this?
Sure. Well, first of all, my dad's political views, I believe, were formed based on his interactions with the political parties that were active in 2002 and 2003, and on the political spectrum that we know here, they would be more towards the left. But I think that in the context of the Russian political system, that would not be entirely accurate. His articles were indeed named The Left Turn, 1 and then 2, and in them he basically assumes responsibility, I believe that's the word he used, for the kind of disenchantment that the Russian society felt after the turbulent, as it's often coined, era of the 90s. Because the privatization was done hastily, and because I have a different view. I think it was done hastily, and my dad believes that it should be revisited, and he actually lined out a proposal of how there could be an additional privatization tax, essentially levied on the businesses privatized during the 90s. My personal opinion is that the country is under extreme financial duress, and yes, the government did not get the best deal possible when privatizing those very, very large enterprises, but they frankly had no other way. So in my personal opinion, that's not my father's opinion, I think that privatization was done not in the best possible way, but I believe it was, and it wasn't the best deal for the government at the time, but under those stressful conditions, economic conditions, I believe it was a fair deal. But my father, certainly being part of the group that has invested and financed the opposition parties active at the time in 2002 and 2003, right until his arrest, that he feels the responsibility for the society not I'm trying to come up with a good word. Not even trying to perceive them as leading parties anymore, because right now what's happening in the opposition movement is essentially you have all these old, established parties, which unfortunately do not attract any following, or hardly any following during these protests, because people believe that figures like Nemtsov and Yavlinsky have had a chance to demonstrate their what they can do on the government level, and they believe, in my view, incorrectly, that they have failed. So they're hence not willing to follow them anymore, and are waiting for these new leaders to emerge that they can put their faith and their trust in. So I think that's the kind of responsibility that my father is assuming.
Sure. Hi, my name is William Foreman. I work for the University in Global Communications. Just a few weeks ago, the Moscow bureau chief of the magazine Der Spiegel gave a talk on campus about about Putin and Putin's Russia. And one point that he made was that he said that he spent a lot of time with your father, covering your father in the early days. And he said your father was not a champion of human rights and democracy at that time, and he was essentially a late convert to these causes, converted after he started to run afoul of Mr. Putin. And he actually said that the Western media should be ashamed of the way it has portrayed your father as this champion of human rights and civil society and democracy. And I was just curious to see what you had to say about that. Thank you.
Sure. I have heard this criticism before. First, on the facts. The Open Russia Foundation was established long before the attack on Yucas was even conceived. So my father has realized the need for positive contributions towards society long before he has ran afoul of Mr. Putin. And he has started to invest very substantial amounts in educational programs before this has happened. And I believe that ultimately this was one of the catalytical moments in the whole attack on Yucas, because investing in education is unfortunately in the Russian government's mind framework is perceived as investing in a different ideology, which is not true, which is not the case, but that's how they think as a group. And that there was a video testimony to that by Mr. Silayev in one of the movies that were done on the topic of my father's case, where he says that in private conversations with other businessmen that remained free and actively engaged in business activities in Russia, he has asked them, like, why aren't you contributing to the same kinds of educational programs? And the response is virtually the same across the board. I'll only invest in organizations treating sick children. Education is ideology, and so I believe that was one of the major contributing factors. Obviously, the other contributing factor was purely economical. Mr. Sechin was very, very aware of the resources that Yucas as a company has had rights to, and was interested in getting a piece of that action, and ultimately got it all. But I think the best response to that criticism would be that you have to understand the context. You have to understand the turbulency, but ultimately you have to start somewhere. My father has never been exposed to the corporate governance structure when he began to run his business. And over the years, after he has established his bank, Menatep, and got an opportunity to partner with other Western banks and got to see the more normal structures that he could then learn from and emulate. When he went and acquired Yucas in '96, it took some time, but he started to implement all of those principles. So definitely wasn't the starting point, but was a very, very conscious choice to get there. And by 2002, Yucas was the most transparent company in Russia, the only company that has openly published its financials and its list of shareholders. That was a precedent in the Russian business community, and ultimately set the example for the entire industry. Unfortunately, it also made it a very, very good target.
Excuse me, can I add a small comment here? Ekaterina Mishina, the High School of Economics, Moscow, Russia, visiting professor on the University of Michigan Law School. I would like to add a small comment as a former employee of the Open Russia Foundation. To begin with, I would like to make a point that in 90s in Russia, it was really hard to do big business and to be a protector of human rights. These two things never go together. That was really impossible and incompatible. Speaking about the starting of Mikhail Khodorkovsky's career as a defender of human rights, I would like to give you a little bit more details about what the Foundation Open Russia was up to. The educational programs which were running by the main shareholders of Yucas included retraining of judges from all the regions from Russia. Judges from both courts of general jurisdiction and from the courts which are in charge of solving economic disputes were brought to Moscow on the expense of the Open Russia Foundation, and they were taking intensive retraining courses. Usually the courses were for like 4 to 5 days. After the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, of course, there were numerous publications that was the way to bribe judges. No, because that was too cheap. No judge would be bribed by such a way by a 4-day trip to Moscow. Another target point. Absolutely, there was a price list, and such a small amount of money and such a small service didn't count. Another target point was training of regional journalists, those who were covering legal issues and those who were covering economic issues. There was a separate project started by, which was headed by Irina Yasin, which still exists as a separate legal entity, and the name is the Club of Regional Journalism. And the main idea was to get the journalists from the regions, from the Far East, from Siberia, from the southern part of Russia, the opportunity to meet with the newsmakers in Moscow, to increase their qualification. And the most important thing which was done within this educational program was the so-called project lawmaking. And I was one of the key lawyers on this project. And after the arrest of Khodorkovsky, this project was usually PR'd as a lobbyist project. What we were doing, we were coming up with a weekly research on the agenda of the lower chamber of the Federal Parliament of Russia, looking at the key legislative drafts, coming up with the independent expert opinions. And 6 months after the start of this project, we got a call from the legal department of the lower chamber of the parliament, and we were invited. I was personally invited to the legal department of the Duma, and we worked in cooperation. So this so-called lobbyism of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, which was performed through the Open Russia Foundation, in reality deeply contributed to the lawmaking progress in Russia at that time. And I personally think that was a big contribution to the democratization and to the defense of human rights, and of course, the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky terminated all this wonderful beginning. Thank you very much for your time. And Pavel, I think that Mikhail Khodorkovsky must be very proud of you. Thank you for what you are doing.
Thank you, Katya.
Anyone who have, if you
Sure.
have a question, please come to the microphone.
I'm Marin Turk, a graduate student in the Slavic department. Thank you for your talk. So my question is, your father's arrest set in motion the degeneration of the legal system, or you said, to the point where we are today, where there's virtually no independent judiciary. Can you talk a bit more about this gradual process? On what levels did it occur? What sorts of individuals were involved? What tactics were employed? And was the public aware of this degeneration as it was going on? To what extent was this an attack? Was this attack on the legal system planned and coordinated? And sort of in connection with Ekaterina Mishina's comments, what happened to all the people and the judges who were trained by Open Russia? What are they where are they today? And how are they relating to the legal system? Thank you.
Excellent set of questions. So can you cover all of it?
I'll try.
Some of them.
So some of the basic procedures that were used to utilize the court as a way to solve business conflict was centered around the 3 months pretrial detention, because you could very easily, using bribes, using personal relationships with investigators and prosecutors and judges, could very easily be guaranteed placing your competitor or his top management under pretrial detention on the alleged, most often, tax evasion, but there were other popular launchpad cases. Another thing that, another method that was popular is, sorry, lost my train of thought. I was trying to remember all your questions. So the pretrial detention, the other one. Well, I can tell you an example of the corruption procedure of, and this is anecdotal evidence, but I believe you may find it interesting. On the local level, being guaranteed a certain result in the court, oftentimes had a starting price point. So with two competing groups of people lobbying for the same judge's attention would often result in the lower bribe being refunded with an apology. I don't believe that it's happening anymore because I think people are getting too greedy. But a friend of mine who, just to give you another example with utilizing courts, a friend of mine went to Tufts, and we were roommates in Boston. I went to Babson College. He went to Tufts, he considered doing an MBA, but went back home to help his family run the business. They are in oil extraction, not the black one, but the one that's used for food. And they have a extraction plant in Tula. One of the ways of how he described his business came under attack was tax inquiry, tax investigation. And the reason to why it's a very effective tool, that's the other thing that I wanted to tell you, and I lost it momentarily, is you can essentially place a cease and desist order on the business. So they had to shut down operations for 3 months at some point because they were under investigation. And obviously, for a manufacturing facility, a 3-month shutdown is crippling. You're losing money, you're losing your market share to a competitor, and ultimately, if you're not able to, either get access to an independent court and get a proper hearing, or have an extra legal way of solving your problem, you are, running out of money while the case is in process, under investigation. So either that, or placing top management, or the CEO, or the chairman of the board in pretrial detention. Very, very popular schemes. Sorry. One of the other, so to answer that, to answer the question about what has happened to the judges that were trained. Unfortunately, I don't know their individual stories. Maybe Katya Mishina can pitch in. No?
Nothing actually happened. Absolutely. They increased their qualification and got back to their cities and small towns, and were very happy.
I had the same, I did not, I obviously didn't participate in that program, but the one I can attest to was the New Civilization program.
Mm-hmm.
It was essentially, democracy boot camp. Let's try to translate it this way. It was a 2-week gamified type of boot camp where you would create a country, a virtual country, with its currency and all of its institutions, and you would run for positions in the government, and you would work, and you would get unemployment benefits, and you'd get salaries, and you would have to pay rent, and those programs were run for a number of years, and I participated in one of them, I believe in 2001 or 2000, and it was fun times. But the basic principle was very simple: introduce children to the concepts of democracy so they can understand on a very, very applicable to their everyday lives level of how a country should be run and how it can effectively be run using the democratic system. So we've had weddings, we've had a number of different jobs. I ended up working as an interpreter, and I translated a bunch of literature for Boy Scouts on the same trip. So it was a very, very good introduction. But once again, the reason why I brought this up is, once again, unfortunately, in the Russian society, I believe there is this built-in pessimism bordering on ignorance, because I do know a lot of people that participated with me, for example, in the same trip. I have no idea where they are right now. I have no idea whether they are participating or not, but what I have heard is that a lot of them have taken jobs in the government, in various government agencies, because that's one of the best career paths right now. And that provides stability. Once again, the same idea, provides stability, income, and a possibility for additional income. And unfortunately, that's true. And also on that point, I always been thinking that the last generation that would be skeptical of democratic promise would be the one that has participated in the events of the 90s. And then the next generation would be completely removed from all the skepticism because they would frankly just not remember what has happened. Unfortunately, the reality was starkly different, and with these kids who are now 17, 18, going to college, they are choosing professions that provide the best possible opportunity for that additional income, because seeing as it is their peers and people they're looking up to as their role models progressing, because nobody thinks in the categories of corruption everywhere and how bad it is for the country. They look at their friends who are a couple of years older and what kind of careers they're choosing and what kind of income they receive, and obviously the jobs like customs and municipal office provide a very, very good stream of income and changes the whole priority. So the most, I believe one of the most popular career paths right now is a customs officer, because that carries a big promise, financial promise.
Becoming a judge after 5 years in customs office.
Yeah.
That's the usual way.
Sorry, I may not have addressed all your questions.
That was good.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, last question, okay?
Let's end on a positive note. My name is Amanda Ross, and I'm just a member of the Michigan community, Ann Arbor community. You started off your presentation talking about the future. You kind of backtracked from the future just now, thinking about what it could have been and what you thought. So if you were to, you're a business guy, if you were to let yourself think out 25 years from now, right now Russia's economy is basically built around natural resources and oil and gas. What do you think the Russian economy could look like in 20, 25 years? What do you think are the careers that instead of the tamozhnik, someone can do something else? Just your thoughts in the future.
Sure. Love the idea. Let's end on a positive note. Someone asked me literally in 2008, I believe, when Medvedev was promoting this whole idea of modernization and how he's going to reinvent the tech sector in Russia by opening up projects like Skolkovo. People in the US asked me if, since I was working in the tech industry, I'm actually an IT manager by career choice, if I would go back to Russia and work. And my answer was nuanced. Of course I want to, but the problem right now is that there is no infrastructure. And I don't mean it in terms of roads and hospitals and stuff like that, although that is notably absent as well. Or not absent, but in a dismal state because there was lack of infrastructure investment. But it will require some time to build up, for example, a good post-delivery system. Courier companies like FedEx and UPS, where my company, my commercial company, Enertiv, is in manufacturing business, and we're able to get components from Texas in one day. In Russia, that would be impossible. There are no printed circuit board fabrication houses where you can submit a design online and get the board within a couple of weeks. That just does not exist. So I think that the next couple of years will be spent on building up that infrastructure. That would be the first step. After that, there are, and it's evident right now that there is a big potential, because already there are a number of very promising tech startups that have emerged in Russia that are software-based, because software obviously does not require that infrastructure to be built up. So I think it will take a little bit of time to build up the infrastructure, after which the physical tech sector can catch on. That's why I think the Skolkovo project has not been successful yet, because companies who are trying to get incentivized by the Russian government to come in, they don't see that infrastructure, so hence they're not really trying to pour in resources, because they see this large potential consumer market, but don't see the infrastructure required to actually bring their manufacturing to Russia. So that's one of the positive things that I see happening in the near future. And also, funny you asked about the natural resources, because Olga and I were just talking about oil and gas exports being used as a lever in foreign policy. And I think two things will happen. First of all, the gas cutoffs that happened over the course of the last 5 years, demonstrating the willpower of the Russian state and actually using that lever against their trading partners, has set off a chain of events in Western Europe where they're trying to diversify away from Russian gas. And since I'm in the energy efficiency sector, so we're tracking renewables. Germany has been leading the way. Spain has been leading the way in terms of building up the renewable capacity. So that will take some time. That will not be 5 to 10 years. That will be closer to 20, 25 years. I believe that in 20 to 25 years, Russia will just not have that lever anymore available, because the gas supply will be diversified and renewables will take a much more significant role in the energy supply in both Western and Eastern Europe. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that the Russian government is notorious for mismanagement of its resources. That's why they're trying to attract foreign investment right now by partnering with companies like BP, like Statoil in Norway, because they need the technology. Their extraction in the oil field is extremely low. That's not Yucas. Rosneft does not work that way. They're leaving some fields behind with over 30% unextracted. So that's they realize that they have a problem, but because of the widespread scale of the corruption, they may not have enough time to solve this problem. Russia is 154th country in the list of most corrupt countries in the world. It's right there down the list in the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, out of 184, 87 countries. So it's right there was the cream of the crop. So my point is that there might not be any other choice than to modernize the economy, and that will be a positive event, because the groups that are in power right now that rely on oil and gas exports and they have no other way and do not want to change their sphere of interests will frankly run out of money. So this modernization will be catalyzed by both external and internal factors, and that's how the society will progress. I really do hope that in next 5 to 10 years I'll be able to have a similar type of tech business that I have in the US back home. Thank you.
I want to thank Pavel for this very insightful and personal presentation. I want to thank everyone who participated in the discussion. And at the end, I want to allow a few minutes for Alex Zimberg, who arranged, who is director of this exhibit, to say a few words about your work before we have time to look at it. And once again, Pavel, thank you so much. I'm really impressed, and I hope we will cooperate. Okay? We will cooperate more.
I just want to thank Pavel. That was an excellent speech. And also thank you to the University of Michigan, CREES, and to everyone that helped on this project. It was really, really wonderful, and it was so much fun to work with you. I had a really great time. Something that Pavel spoke about in his talk was that the state of Russian media is lacking for people that want to express dissent or express their political opinion in general, unless it's very pro what's happening. And also, there are certain laws that restrict people from getting out in the streets and protesting. It makes that illegal. So, and then in the blogosphere, you can be traced by your IP address, whatever it is that you're traced by. So what post-Soviet graffiti does is it goes a step further, and it looks at the anonymous art happening in the street and how artists and activists and members of the community can use spray paint and markers and create stencils and address those issues which they feel are not being addressed in the mainstream media. And the project started as a master's thesis at Georgetown University and has since expanded thanks to certain grants from Cosmos Club and Georgetown University. Cosmos Club is in Washington, D.C. And while we went all over Eastern Europe, all over Russia throughout the summer and returned to Russia in March of 2012 during the election period, this exhibit specifically focuses on Russia. And it's very interesting. It touches on all the different ideas. It touches on jailed activists. It touches on the memory of Tsarist history or Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. It touches on ideas of fascism and opposition meetings. It's the way that the opposition would often, speak to mobilize people to come to their meetings to talk about how to come together as a unified force. And we have all kinds of other ideas. So I hope that you enjoy it. And thank you again for Pavel and to CREES. You did a great job. Thank you.